Promise number 2, dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people. Of course, the surest way to put the federal government back to work for the American people is to reduce its size and scope back to something resembling the original constitutional intent. Conservatives desire a smaller government not for its own sake, but for the sake of human flourishing. But the Washington establishment doesn't want a constitutionally limited government because it means they lose power and are all held more accountable by the people who put them in power. Like restoring popular sovereignty, the task of reattaching the federal government's constitutional and democratic tethers calls to mind Ronald Reagan's observation that there are no easy answers, but there are simple answers. In the case of making the federal government smaller, more effective, and accountable, the simple answer is the Constitution itself. The surest proof of this is how strenuously and creatively generations of progressives and many Republican insiders have worked to cut themselves free from the strictures of the 1789 Constitution and subsequent amendments. Consider the federal budget. Under current law, Congress is required to pass a budget and 12 issue-specific spending bills comporting with it every single year. The last time Congress did so was in 1996. Congress no longer meaningfully budgets, authorizes, or categorizes spending. Instead, party leaders negotiate one multi-trillion-dollar spending bill, several thousand pages long, and then vote on it before anyone literally has had a chance to read it. Debate time is restricted, amendments are prohibited, and all of this is backed up against a midnight deadline when the previous omnibus spending bill will run out and the federal government shuts down. This process is not designed to empower 330 million American citizens and their elected representatives, but rather to empower the party elites secretly negotiating without any public scrutiny or oversight. In the end, congressional leaders' behavior and incentives here are no different from those of global elites, insulating policy decisions over the climate, trade, public health, you name it, from the sovereignty of national electorates. Public scrutiny and democratic accountability make life harder for policymakers, so they skirt it. It's not dysfunction, it's corruption. And despite its gaudy price tag, the federal budget is not even close to the worst example of this corruption. That distinction belongs to the administrative state, the dismantling of which must a top priority for the next conservative president. That's a typo. It should say of which must be a top priority. The term administrative state refers to the policy-making work done by the bureaucracies of all the federal government's departments, agencies, and millions of employees. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. That is, federal law is enacted only by elected legislators in both houses of Congress. This exclusive authority was part of the framers' doctrine of separated powers. They not only split the federal government's legislative, executive, and judicial powers into different branches, they also gave each branch checks over the others. Under our Constitution, the legislative branch, Congress, is far and away the most powerful and correspondingly the most accountable to the people. In recent decades, members of the House and Senate discovered that if they give away that power to the Article 2 branch of government, they can also deny responsibility for its actions. So today in Washington, most policy is no longer set by Congress at all, but by the administrative state. Given the choice between being powerful but vulnerable or irrelevant but famous, most members of Congress have chosen the latter. Congress passes intentionally vague laws that delegate decision-making over a given issue to a federal agency. That agency's bureaucrats, not just unelected but seemingly unfireable, then leap at the chance to fill the vacuum created by Congress's preening cowardice. The federal government is growing larger and less constitutionally accountable, even to the president, every year. A combination of elected and unelected bureaucrats of the Environmental Protection Agency quietly strangles domestic energy production through difficult-to-understand rulemaking processes. Bureaucrats at the Department of Homeland Security, following the lead of a feckless administration, order border and immigration enforcement agencies to help migrants criminally enter our country with impunity. Bureaucrats at the Department of Education inject racist, anti-American, ahistorical propaganda into America's classrooms. Bureaucrats at the Department of Justice force school districts to undermine girls' sports and parents' rights to satisfy transgender extremists. Woke bureaucrats at the Pentagon forced troops to attend training seminars about white privilege, and bureaucrats at the State Department infuse U.S. foreign aid programs with woke extremism about intersectionality and abortion. Unaccountable federal spending is at the secret lifeblood of the Great Awakening. Nearly every power center held by the left is funded or supported, one way or another, through the bureaucracy by Congress. Colleges and school districts are funded by tax dollars. The administrative state holds 100% of its power at the sufferance of Congress, and its insulation from presidential discipline is an unconstitutional fairy tale spun by the Washington establishment to protect its turf. Members of Congress shield themselves from constitutional accountability often when the White House allows them to get away with it. Cultural institutions like public libraries and public health agencies are only as independent from public accountability as elected officials and voters permit. Let's be clear, the most egregious regulations promulgated by the current administration come from one place, the Oval Office. The president cannot hide behind the agencies, as his many executive orders make clear. His is the responsibility for the regulations that threaten American communities, schools, and families. A conservative president must move swiftly to do away with these vast abuses of presidential power and remove the career and political bureaucrats who fuel it. Properly considered, restoring fiscal limits and constitutional accountability to the federal government is a continuation of restoring national sovereignty to the American people. In foreign affairs, global strategy, federal budgeting, and policymaking, the same pattern emerges again and again. Ruling elites slash and tear restrictions and accountability placed on them. They centralize power up and away from the American people. To supranational treaties and organizations, to left-wing experts, to sight unseen all-or-nothing legislating, to the unelected career bureaucrats of the administrative state. As monolithic as the left's institution power appears to be, it originates with appropriations from Congress and is made complete by a feckless president. A conservative president must look to the legislative branch for decisive action. The administrative state is not going anywhere until Congress acts to retrieve its own power from bureaucrats and the White House. But in the meantime, there are many executive tools a courageous conservative president can use to handcuff the bureaucracy, push Congress to return to its constitutional responsibility, restore power over Washington to the American people, bring the administrative state to heel, and in the process defang and defund the woke culture warriors who have infiltrated every last institution in America. The conservative promise lays out how to use many of these tools, including how to fire supposedly unfireable federal bureaucrats, how to shutter wasteful. The conservative promise lays out how to use many of these tools, including how to fire supposedly unfireable federal bureaucrats, how to shutter wasteful and corrupt bureaus and offices, how to muzzle woke propaganda at every level of government, how to restore the American people's constitutional authority over the administrative state, and how to save untold taxpayer dollars in the process. Finally, the president can restore public confidence and accountability to our most important government function of all, national defense. The American people desire a military full of highly skilled servicemen and women who can protect the homeland and our interests overseas. The next conservative president must end the left's social experimentation with the military, restore warfighting as its sole mission, and set defeating the threat of the Chinese Communist Party at its highest priority. The next conservative president must possess the courage to relentlessly put the interests of the everyday American over the desires of the ruling elite. Their outreach cannot be prevented. It must simply be ignored, and it can be. The left derives its power from the institutions they control, but those institutions are only powerful to the extent that constitutional officers surrender their own legitimate authority to them. A president who refuses to do so and uses his or her office to reimpose constitutional authority over federal policymaking can begin to correct decades of corruption and remove thousands of bureaucrats from the positions of public trust they have so long abused. Promise number 3. Defend our nation's sovereignty, borders, and bounty against global threats. The United States belongs to we the people. All government authority derives from the consent of the people, and our nation's success derives from the character of its people. The American people's right to rule over ourselves is the obverse of our duty. We cannot outsource to others our obligation to ensure the conditions that allow our families, local communities, churches, and synagogues and neighborhoods to thrive. The buck stops with each of us, so each of us must have the freedom to pursue the good for ourselves and those entrusted to our care. To most Americans, this is common sense, but in Washington, D.C. and other centers of leftist power like the media and the academy, this statement of basic civics is branded hate speech. Progressive elites speak in lofty terms of openness, progress, expertise, cooperation, and globalization. But too often these terms are just rhetorical Trojan horses concealing their true intention, stripping we the people of our constitutional authority over our country's future. America's corporate and political elites do not believe in the ideal to which our nation is dedicated: self-governance, the rule of law, and ordered liberty. They certainly do not trust the American people, and they disdain the Constitution's restrictions on their ambitions. Instead, they believe in a kind of 21st century Wilsonian order in which the enlightened, highly educated managerial elite runs things rather than the humble, patriotic working families who make up the majority of what the elites contemptuously call flyover country. This Wilsonian hubris has spread like a cancer through many of America's largest corporations, its public institutions, and its popular culture. Those who run our so-called American corporations have bent to the will of the woke agenda and care for more of their foreign investors and organizations than their American workers and customers. Today, nearly every top-tier U.S. university president or Wall Street hedge fund manager has more in common with a socialist European head of state than with the parents at a high school football game in Waco, Texas. Many elites' entire identity, it seems, is wrapped up in the sense of superiority over those people, but under our Constitution, they are the mere equals of the workers who shower after worker instead of before. This is as it should and must be. Intellectual sophistication, advanced degrees, financial success, and all other markers of elite status have no bearing on a person's knowledge of the one thing most necessary for governance: what it means to live well. That knowledge is available to each of us, no matter how humble our backgrounds or how unpretentious our attainments. It is open to us to read in the book of human nature, to which we are all offered the key just by merit of our shared humanity. But one of the great premises of American political life is that everyone who can read in that book must have a voice in deciding the course and fate of our republic. Progressive policymakers and pundits in America either fail to understand this premise or intentionally reject it. They enthusiastically support supranational organizations like the United Nations and European Union, which are run and staffed almost entirely by people who share their values and are mostly insulated from the influence of national elections. That's why they are eager for America to sign international treaties on everything from pharmaceutical patents to climate change to the rights of the child, and why those treaties invariably endorse policies that could never pass through the U.S. Congress. Like the progressive Woodrow Wilson a century ago, the woke left today seeks a world bound by global treaties they write, in which they exercise dictatorial powers over all nations without being subject to democratic accountability. That's why today's progressive left so cavalierly supports open borders despite the lawless humanitarian crisis their policy created along America's southern border. They seek to purge the very concept of the nation state from the American ethos, no matter how much crime increases or resources drop for schools and hospitals or wages decrease for the working class. Open borders activism is a classic example of what the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer called cheap grace, publicly promoting one's own virtue without risking any personal inconvenience. Indeed, the only direct impact of open borders on pro-open borders elites is that the constant flow of illegal immigration suppresses the wages of their housekeepers, landscapers, and busboys. Cheap grace aptly describes the left's love affair with environmental extremism. Those who suffer most from the policies environmentalism would have us enact are the aged, poor, and vulnerable. It is not a political cause, but a pseudo-religion meant to baptize liberals' ruthless pursuit of absolute power in the holy water of environmental virtue. At its very heart, environmental extremism is decidedly anti-human. Stewardship and conservation are supplanted by population control and economic regression. Environmental ideologues would ban the fuels that run almost all of the world's cars, planes, factories, farms, and electricity grids. Abandoning confidence in human resilience and creativity in responding to the challenges of the future would raise impediments to the most meaningful human activities. They would stand human affairs on their head, regarding human activity itself as fundamentally a threat to be sacrificed to the God of nature. The same goals are the heart of elite support for economic globalization. For 30 years, America's political, economic, and cultural leaders embraced and enriched Communist China and its genocidal Communist Party while hollowing out America's industrial base. What may have started out with good intentions has now been made clear. Unfettered trade with China has been a catastrophe. It has made a handful of American corporations enormously profitable while twisting business incentives away from the American people's needs. For a generation, politicians of both parties promised that engagement with Beijing would grow our economy while injecting American values into China. The opposite has happened. American factories have closed, jobs have been outsourced, our manufacturing economy has been financialized, and all along the corporations profiting failed to export our values of human rights and freedom. Rather, they imported China's anti-American values into their C-suites. Even before the rise of big tech, Wall Street ignored China's serial theft of American intellectual property. I just want to point out that they say anti-American values into their C, the letter C, suites. Even before the rise of big tech, Wall Street ignored China's serial theft of American intellectual property. It outright cheered the elimination of American manufacturing jobs. Learn to code, they would gloat. These were just the price of progress. Engagement was, at every step, Beijing's project, not America's. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, dictated terms only to break them whenever it suited them. They stole our technology, spied on our people, and threatened our allies, all with trillions of dollars of wealth and military power financed by their access to our market. Then came the rise of big tech, which is now less a contributor to the U.S. economy than it is a tool of China's government. In exchange for cheap labor and regulatory special treatment from Beijing, America's largest technology firms funnel data about Americans to the CCP. They hand over sensitive intellectual property with military and intelligence applications to keep the money rolling in. They let Beijing censor Chinese users on their platforms. They let the CCP set their corporate policies about mobile apps, and they run interference for our rivals' political priorities in Washington. One side of big tech companies' business model is old-fashioned American competitiveness and world-changing technological innovation. But increasingly, that side of these businesses is overshadowed by their role as operatives in the lucrative employ of America's most dangerous international enemy. If you want to understand the danger posed by collaboration between big tech and the CCP, look no further than TikTok. The highly addictive video app used by 80 million Americans every month and overwhelmingly popular among teenage girls is in effect a tool of Chinese espionage. The ties between TikTok and the Chinese government are not loose, and they are not coincidental. The same can be observed by many U.S. colleges and universities. Though the CCP's Confucius Institutes, Beijing has been just as successful at compromising and co-opting our higher education system as they have at compromising and co-opting corporate America. A casual reader might take the last few pages as surveying a broad array of challenges facing the American people and the next conservative president: supernatural national policymaking, border security, globalization, engagement with China, manufacturing, big tech, and Beijing compromised colleges. But these really are not many issues, but two. One, that China is a totalitarian enemy of the United States, not a strategic partner or fair competitor, and two, that America's elites have betrayed the American people. The solution to all of the above problems is not to tinker with this or that government program to replace this or that bureaucrat. These are problems not of technocratic efficiency, but of national sovereignty and constitutional governance. We solve them not by trimming and reshaping the leaves, but by ripping out the trees, root and branch. International organizations and agreements that erode our Constitution, rule of law, or popular sovereignty should not be reformed. They should be abandoned. Illegal immigration should be ended, not mitigated. The border sealed, not reprioritized. Economic engagement with China should be ended, not rethought. Our manufacturing and industrial base should be restored, not allowed to deteriorate further. Confucius Institutes, TikTok, and any other arm of Chinese propaganda and espionage should be outlawed, not merely monitored. Universities taking money from the CCP should lose their accreditation, charters, and eligibility for federal funds. The next conservative president should go beyond merely defending America's energy interests, but go on offense, asserting them around the world. America's vast reserves of oil and natural gas are not an environmental problem. They are the lifeblood of economic growth. American dominance of the global energy market would be a good thing for the world and, more importantly, for we the people. It's not just about jobs, even though unleashing domestic energy production would create millions of them. It's not just about higher wages for workers who didn't go to college, though they would receive the raises they have missed out for 2 generations. Full spectrum strategic energy dominance would facilitate the reinvigoration of America's entire industrial and manufacturing sector as we disentangle our economy from China. Globally, it would rebalance power away from dangerous regimes in Russia and the Middle East. It would build powerful alliances with fast-growing nations in Africa and provide us the leverage to counter Chinese ambitions in South America and the Pacific. Locally, it would drive billions of dollars of private investment to the communities that have been hammered by globalization since the 1990s. And it would clarify our intentions to Beijing that the next president can ensure that a large part of America's reindustrialization is in the production of the equipment we will need to dissuade future foreign meddling with U.S. vital interests.